energy and air pollution will be one of the top 5 issues for the general election.
We talk about Putin being in control. He's not really. It's the various factions under him, and it suits them to have him at the front.
If you're trying to save for a house deposit and you'd have to save up some crazy amount of money, how on earth are you going to do that if a pint is £7?
There's certain key things that we want from India and there's certain key things that they want from us.
Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Lizzy Burden. Coming up on today's programme, we'll be discussing Keir Starmer's speech on the situation in the Middle East as he tries to reunite his party.
But first, we've been listening to today's hearing of the official COVID inquiry. The headline act today is the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson's chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, lifting the lid even further on his former boss's handling of the pandemic. The warm-up, Lizzy, was Johnson's Director of Communications, Lee Kane.
Now, this inquiry formally began in June last year with hearings this autumn to look at the political decisions made during the pandemic. COVID-19, of course, having resulted in some 227,000 deaths in the UK. And in yesterday's session, we were reminded why Dominic Cummings is such a crucial figure in all this. Take a listen to Martin Reynolds' evidence yesterday. He was another of Johnson's top aides.
In my view, he was the most empowered Chief of Staff Downing Street has seen, and was the person who's ruled and was able to drive things through the machine in a way I suspect few other Chiefs of Staff have done.
And Caroline, you might remember the name Martin Reynolds for another reason, because he was famously dubbed Party Marty by the tabloids for being the man in Downing Street who organised one of the big Partygate gatherings.
Well, then this morning, at one point particularly painful in the testimony, Lee Kane agreed with a WhatsApp message that described the Cabinet Office as, quote, terrifyingly, though he said he'd perhaps choose different words. He also agreed that there was a lack of leadership, general chaos. Take a listen.
I want to press you a little bit, Mr. Kane, about whether the extent to which you endorse what Mr. Cummings was saying here. He's clearly saying, isn't he, that the reason that you and others are driving and directing is because those who should be doing it, that is the Cabinet Office, are not. I mean, to use his words, they are terrifyingly. Do you agree with that?
I might not quite use the same language, but generally, yes.
Can you give us a bit more detail then? I mean, who was it? Were individuals or sections within the Cabinet Office that were failing at that crucial moment?
I think the point really was nobody quite knew. Who was the point person? Who was in charge? Who should be driving this machine? Who is meant to be in charge of coordinating of all the policy? If you ask me now, who was supposed to be doing that in those early weeks and months, I couldn't tell you. There was nobody holding their hands up, taking responsibility.
So that was Lee Kane, who was at the time, of course, the Director of Communications for Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister. It followed another excruciating part of yesterday's session. The inquiry was shown a WhatsApp message sent by the Cabinet Secretary Simon Case to Dominic Cummings, in which Case said that he was at the end of his tether with Johnson's flip-flopping on how to handle the pandemic.
Now look, today's testimony has been long in the diary. Smart people have been warning about this for a long time, that it could be a headache for the current Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, because of course he was Chancellor at the time, because it really takes the public right back to the moment when majority opinion turned against the Conservative Party.
Look, I mean, you've also got to remember that Baroness Hallett had to fight to make these messages public, the WhatsApp messages. And so finally we are hearing them, that the sort of revelations of what happened behind the scenes during the pandemic. The initial report from the inquiry from Hallett is not expected to be published at the earliest. She's talking about summer 2024. But these 7 or so weeks, when we get the public hearings of these officials so crucial and at the heart of the pandemic response from the UK government at the time, to be hearing from them in their own words is a really big deal.
And also don't forget, of course, we're going to hear from the current Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson giving their own evidence at some stage in this inquiry. So there's much, much more to come.
And Lizzy, Emily Ashton, the UK government reporter here at Bloomberg, who has been tracking this whole COVID hearing and inquiry process, will be joining us to discuss in greater detail everything that's been happening at these first initial hearings on Thursday. Now, Keir Starmer has given a speech on the Israel-Gaza war at Chatham House in London today, as he has come under pressure from within his own Labour Party to clarify his position. He has talked about, whilst understanding calls for a, quote, ceasefire at this stage, he does not believe that it is the correct position now. Instead, the Labour leader has called for a cessation of fighting, not a ceasefire. Have a listen to some of what he had to say.
While I understand calls for a ceasefire at this stage, I do not believe that it is the correct position now, for two reasons. One, because a ceasefire always freezes any conflict in the state where it currently lies. And as we speak, that would leave Hamas with the infrastructure and the capability to carry out the sort of attack we saw on October the 7th. Attacks that are still ongoing. Hostages who should be released, still held. Hamas would be emboldened and start preparing for future violence immediately. The reality is that neither the long-term security of Israel nor long-term justice for Palestine can be delivered by bombs and bullets. Open-ended military action, action without a clear and desired political outcome, is ultimately futile. This needs to begin now, because a political agreement, however unlikely that seems today, however painful the first steps are to take, is the only way to resolve this conflict once and for all. That is why our position and our counsel has always been that Israel must submit to the rules of international law. The right to self-defense is fundamental, but it's not a blank check. The supply of basic utilities like water, medicines, electricity, and yes, fuel to civilians in Gaza cannot be blocked by Israel.
OK, so that was Keir Starmer, and we're joined now by our government reporter Alex Morales with us in the studio. Alex, thank you. You've had two warnings there. One to Israel, that it must follow international law, that its right to self-defence isn't a blank cheque, and another warning to those in his party who've been quitting. He spelt out the game plan of Hamas, a plan written in blood, as he put it, to force Israel to respond, which would isolate Israel from the West. Do you detect any changes in policy here?
Certainly, the policies remain the same. Labour's been sticking to this line that they need pauses and not a ceasefire, and it's a ceasefire that Labour's sort of the grassroots of Labour are really calling for. But he's also, in his speech, given quite a few criticisms of Israel, which may go some way towards allaying some of their concerns. He talked about the need to push the political process towards a two-state solution, which hasn't really been sort of at the forefront of the international agenda in recent years. He's talked about Israel needing to stop settlements in the West Bank. And also, he's sort of stressed the importance of these pauses, saying we need to get vital water, power, medicines and food into Gaza. And so he sort of homed in on the real purpose of these pauses, which in essence, what everyone wants is a stop to the bombardment of Gaza. And in his mind, a pause is a better way of doing this because it doesn't give Hamas the blank check as well to sort of rebuild and perhaps plan another of these atrocious attacks. Yeah, and he talked about a ceasefire always freezes a current conflict in the state that it lies. I mean, I think it is interesting. His emphasis on the long term around bringing about a two-state solution, but on the immediate, he did call for there to be even fuel brought to Gaza. So he was putting pressure on Israel, to try to deliver that, or that they must deliver that
allow that to be delivered to the Gaza Strip. Is this going further in criticism of Israel than the Labour Party has been before? What's your view?
Well, certainly, let's sort of wind back. And part of the reason Starmer's under so much pressure from the grassroots is an interview he gave to LBC, but I think it was the 11th of October, but it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, in which he was asked, is a siege appropriate? Cutting off power, cutting off water. And he replied, I think Israel does have that right. It's an ongoing situation. Now, that was interpreted by the grassroots as him essentially giving the green light for Israel to switch off power and water to Gaza, which it's not what he meant, but it's how it came across. And so he's been in sort of retreat mode on that ever since. And so he's used this opportunity now to make very clear that Israel needs to be allowing power and water to get through, and there's also food and medicines.
How big of a issue is this politically for him in terms of the split in the Labour Party at this point? Because it seems to be the biggest challenge he's faced so far.
Well, two things on this. One, in a way, it's given him an opportunity to underscore how much he's changed the party since Jeremy Corbyn left. And he's not, he's shown in his 3 years in the leadership that he's prepared to alienate the far left of his party in order to reach out to the centre ground of UK voters. But in terms of the splits in his party, I mean, clearly they're appearing. He's had councillors resigned in Oxford, Glasgow, Manchester. He's got front benchers calling for him to call for a ceasefire. And he was suspended another MP from the party whip recently because of comments that MP made at a protest march. So clearly he's got internal problems. Mm-hmm. Whether this speech goes far enough to sort of tamper down tensions within the party, it's hard to tell. I mean, I left right at the end of the speech, so I didn't hear what some of the follow-up questions would be. But the fact that he's given this speech at Chatham House as well, rather than perhaps a more hostile audience of, he could have gone to somewhere like Bethnal Green, where there's a large Muslim constituency. He might have faced quite a bit of hostile questioning there, whereas Chatham House is probably a safer ground for him to give that speech.
Yeah. In terms of also, and Starmer brought it back to what is happening here in the UK, the impact on communities in Britain, and he talked about the UK being a modern, diverse democracy, of Jews, Christians, Muslims living side by side, and that isn't underlined enough in the UK. So he was trying to sort of bring a much more conciliatory tone towards this. And yet we have also seen the language become more inflamed in the UK, and obviously that some sections of the population feel very strongly about this. The Home Secretary yesterday branded pro-Palestine protests as, quote, hate marches, and there's been a lot of criticism around the use of that sort of language. So how much is this actually affecting the UK, let alone it becoming actually an issue for voters at a general election?
Well, certainly there are marches on both sides, but I've also heard lots of people saying, look, this is a political issue in the Middle East. It's not a clash between Muslims and Jews in Britain. But certainly there will be those who do see it as a clash. I think one of the problematic calls in these really quite large protest marches is the use of the phrase "from the river to the sea." Now that has a historic context that predates Hamas, where it was sort of a call for a Palestinian state, presumably alongside an Israeli state. But in the context of Hamas, I think many Jews interpret it as get rid of the Jews from this land. So they interpret it as ethnic cleansing. So it's a very problematic call. And
which
clearly
is what the Home Secretary was trying to point out partly.
I presume that's what she was. Yes, that's what she would have been alluding to. But for the Tories also, it's an area where they see they can create divisions within Labour. Because Labour is divided on this issue. And the Tories are looking for any sort of dividing line. They're so far behind in the polls. They're looking for ways of making political capital as well.
OK, our UK government editor, Alex Morales, thank you so much for your analysis, being with us in the studio. You talked about the impact here in the UK domestically, and with such a polarised debate, Is there a possible path to placate the unrest in the UK's minority communities? It's a question we raised with Sunder Katwala, Director of British Future, which is a non-partisan think tank looking into identity, immigration and ways to find common ground in the UK. He's also the former General Secretary of the Fabian Society, a left-wing group. And we asked Sunder about why the word ceasefire has become so difficult for Labour.
There's a real tension in some of the calls for a ceasefire. When Sadiq Khan, the London mayor, called for a ceasefire, he said both that he agreed with the right to defend itself and the right to pursue Hamas, but also that the cost or this way of pursuing the war was wrong, and so he wanted a ceasefire. So, one reason that the Mayor of Manchester, the Mayor of London, the Scottish First Minister, maybe even the leader of the Labour Party doesn't need to necessarily resolve those tensions is that they're calling for what they want to see in the world, which is, a peaceful resolution, a two-state solution, international law upheld while there's a conflict, without really owning those decisions, because I think, Britain was very, very central to the creation of Israel, to the Palestine issue, a century ago. Britain is a relatively minor middle power in the world, and what is said on the left-wing opposition of British politics is not really going to affect what Israel or Hamas do, but they will affect how we feel we've engaged with a conflict in the world.
Yeah, indeed. And so it's, about, as you say, values and ethics then. How can Keir Starmer then bridge the divide, between Labour's official position, which is sort of largely supporting Israel in its right to defend itself, and then the front bench MPs and mayors, as you've mentioned, calling for this ceasefire? How can he navigate that and come up with an answer that sort of speaks to voters in the UK?
I think it will be challenging for him. For most voters in the UK, this is something of a faraway conflict that is very sad, and they're very sorry to see the death on both sides. There are different groups of people who are much more intensely involved in this conflict. That could be your family background, it could be your faith allegiance. If you're Jewish, if you're Muslim, you feel more attached to this conflict. It could be your politics. Younger people who lean left, are more sympathetic to Palestine than Israel. It was a different situation 30 years ago, 50 years ago. I think that is actually the reputational damage of the Netanyahu era to Israel. When I was a young adult, it was very, very easy to say we're on both sides of this conflict because it felt like the two-state solution was something that could happen, even though it didn't happen. I think for a younger generation, it feels much more binary. There's a sense of taking a side. I think one thing Keir Starmer needs to do and the Labour Party needs to do is actually take responsibility for how we talk about the conflict at home. We do have power over how the conflict affects us here. And so, people can take a side if they want, although many people don't want to, but they've got to recognise two sides. They've got to recognise the resolution in the end that we want to see, but also that you're living in communities, you're living in a society where there are different views of this conflict. And we need some sense of mutual respect, how we disagree, how we live alongside each other in mixed and diverse communities.
Yeah, although the Israeli government and Benjamin Netanyahu has framed this quite differently in the speeches that he's given, has framed this as basically a fight against terrorism, as, the need to support Israel, as one to sort of support democratic values, i.e. Western values. So how does that fit?
Yes, I think Netanyahu's vision of Israel isn't the vision that Friends of Israel hold in Britain. Netanyahu says there will never be a Palestinian state. 80-90% of people who are pro-Israel in this country say that they're more sympathetic to Israel. So I say they would like to see a two-state solution. 9 out of 10 people who say they're pro-Palestine also say that. So obviously, opinions are more polarised in the region than they need to be. They need to be in Britain. It's much harder to call for a two-state solution when there's no diplomatic pattern for one. I think what both Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak could try to do is try and engage with the American administration, which is probably the one external actor that might have an influence, which is, I think, a critical friend of Israel, supports the right to respond, but is being increasingly publicly vocal as well as privately pressuring about what are the limits and constraints of international law, what are the limits of constraints of needing a resolution beyond the conflict. Yes, you can go and try and eradicate or degrade Hamas, but what is your actual approach towards Palestine that isn't Hamas in the long term? And that's where the Netanyahu strategy, I think, has run out of road and therefore isn't seen, I think, as speaking for the broad West. There's more sympathy in America, but not the same levels of sympathy that you would have seen a generation ago, because Democrats in America are now rather split on this in the way that a Labour opinion in Britain is.
Okay, there are 19 British Muslim MPs, which you pointed out, a lot of people pointed out, 15 of them in the Labour Party. You say it's a mistake for Labour to frame this as an issue about Muslims. Can you explain why?
Well, there's certainly an intensity of Muslim opinion in the Labour Party. Also, the growth of ethnic minority, faith minority voices in our politics is a good thing. It might make it more challenging, but that's because more perspectives are being reflected. The Labour Party had a debate very much like this around the Iraq War, and lots of left-wing MPs, of course, voted against the Iraq War, which Tony Blair's government held. There was only one Muslim MP in England when the Iraq War happened. That's only 20 years ago. There was one MP in Scotland as well. Anna Sarwar's father was an MP in Scotland. So the Muslim voice in politics was really missing, or was at the local level. It's now in Parliament, but the Muslim MPs have got the same job that all of the Labour MPs have got. They all represent Muslim and non-Muslim constituents in diverse constituencies. You could be a Muslim MP with Jewish constituents, white British constituents. You could be a Jewish MP with Muslim constituents as well. So I think they've got to model this idea that we can protect community relations here from conflict abroad, and then have the democratic debate. What is the right policy of the Labour Party? What is the policy of Rishi Sunak's government? How much influence can a country like Britain have over what we'd like to see in the world, which is a resolution to an intractable conflict? But that means working for solutions that are built from within. And if there isn't Palestinian leadership in the right place to do that, or an Israeli leadership in the right place to do that, we might have to prioritise protecting our community relations here from a conflict abroad in how we advocate what we'd like to see in the world.
Sunder, how important is the Muslim vote to Keir Starmer becoming the next Prime Minister, and is it at risk?
Labour's had a lot of votes from British Muslims over the generations. I think, maybe 1 in 12 Labour votes at the last general election were Muslim, but I think it would be an exaggeration to say that any minority group has a sort of veto on the keys to Downing Street. You could have some quite eye-catching statistics that say, there are 30 Labour MPs where there were more Muslim voters than their majority. But if you actually then look at those diverse inner city constituencies, they're not seats that Labour is going to lose when it's got a massive poll lead. So, Labour lost quite a lot of Muslim votes for a while over the Iraq War. And so if something that big happened, which might be unlikely in a year's time, you might be talking about 250,000 votes, but it's not going to swing the general election next time. It might be a different issue in local government. It might be a different issue in by-elections, the other side of a general election.
But this is surely a test of Keir Starmer, though, in terms of his leadership.
I think it's a test of his party management. It's a test of his public leadership. I think, Labour Muslim councillors and MPs have made a call about what a minority community wants. That's a perfectly legitimate thing to do, but the call should be about what Labour values are about. Keir Starmer's also under pressure from Andy Burnham, Anna Sarwar, and other people who've taken a position to say he should shift his position. So he's got the challenge of taking his party with him and uniting his party, but also showing the public that he can lead on international and foreign policy issues, and persuade his party rather than necessarily always shift his position in response
and
to
so Suella Braverman's comments on the mass protests that we've seen, pro-Palestinian protests in London, her very heightened rhetoric, calling them hate marches. What place does that have?
Well, what she risks doing there is she risks polarising without drawing the right boundaries. And so the way to draw the right boundaries would be to say it's fine, it's democratically legitimate to, march for Israel's right to defend itself, or to march critically of Israel and for peace and for Palestine, as long as you stay within the right boundaries. So she should be, I think, saying that the chant "from the river to the sea" is toxic and people shouldn't be using it, but she shouldn't then be stigmatising everybody who marches for peace in Palestine or the Palestinian flag as a symbol of hate, because then she's failing to make the distinction we want to make, which is between Hamas Hamas and Palestinians, and between, most people who are sympathetic to Palestine say they want to see a two-state solution, don't want to eradicate Israel. So I'd like to see more people on those marches really take stronger action against people using hateful rhetoric that British Jews might find threatening. But also, I think we've got to have the right to democratic process, to allegiance to Israel, to sympathy and support for peace and Palestine. That is the kind of debate and conversation that if you were from the other side of the debate or from another background, you wouldn't feel threatened and intimidated by. And in just declaring, all young people who marched as hateful, I think she's failed to make the right distinctions, or to actually have a policy on countering extremism that the government is in charge of. If they were hate marches, she should be closing them down, and she hasn't actually acted on the Met Commissioner's recommendations for changes in the law to capture some, extreme hateful material that the law doesn't currently catch.
OK, Sunder Katwala, former General Secretary of the Fabian Society and the Director of British Future, a non-partisan think tank. Great to have you with us on the programme.
Well, that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Woolcock and our audio engineer was Marufal Hussain. I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.